As a British Army officer on a late 19th century or early 20th century battlefield, you are not expected to carry the same weaponry and equipment as the other ranks, the private soldiers. However, in battle, you're going to need something to defend yourself. And in the words of Lieutenant George from Blackadder, you are going to need this, a good old service revolver. And this is potentially the most famous of them all. This is the Webley Service Revolver. Now, it's introduced into British Army service in 1887 with the Mark I. You then have the Marks II, III, and one of the most famous, the Mark IV, introduced in 1899 on the very eve of the Boer War, and it becomes known as the Boer War Webley, because as an officer, you're also expected to buy your equipment, and that includes buying your sidearm, your revolver. You can buy any revolver you want, but it must take .455 government ammunition, and that's what this is chambered in. Now, the .455 is a big old slug. That is a big round, and it's intended to essentially stop anyone that's coming towards you. This isn't an offensive weapon. You're not going out to go and shoot people with this. The whole idea is that this stays in your left hand, sword in your right hand if you need it, especially early on. And if someone is coming towards you with the intent of doing you harm, you pulling the trigger and sending one of those 4.55 rounds towards them will stop them in their tracks. In 1914, or in December 1913, the Mark V Webley is approved, and it's really only produced throughout 1914 and early 1915. It is, like all the other Webley revolvers, what's known as a top break revolver. What does that mean? It means that if you push this lever here, rather than the cylinder coming out the side to be loaded, like you might see in a Western film, push this lever here, and the Webley will do exactly that. That there is a top break. This then allows you to load it without having to move the cylinder out from the side. So you take your 4.55 rounds. There are actually loading drills for these that involve placing the revolver quite gently in the left hand in order to load. As an officer, you would have a belt with an ammunition pouch that contained these rounds. You load 6 rounds into the chamber, and then quite simply, with a very satisfying snap, you're ready to go. What else? Well, it has, as with all the early Webley revolvers, what's known as a bird's head grip, this really quite beautiful curved grip, and it is quite ergonomic in the hand. It has a short barrel, although you do see Mark Vs like this one with a long 6-inch barrel. But these were really quite short-lived, and in 1914, in the first part of the war, you see far more of the earlier Mark IVs, which look almost identical, than you do these Mark Vs. However, in early 1915, this thing is introduced. Now this, as to be expected, is the Mark VI, and it is quite a radical departure from what has come before it. If you were to place a Mark I, II, III, IV and V Webley next to each other, if you didn't really know what you were looking at, they'd look very similar. But this is very different. The change of the grip has changed to this squared off, really more ergonomic grip. And that longer 6-inch barrel that has been seen on some of the Mark Vs is now standard for the Mark VI. It functions in the same way. It's a top break revolver. And like all the ones before it, it has an extractor. That's that bit there. And all that does, if I go back to the Mark V for a moment, is once I've loaded my rounds, I've fired them off, or not, I can quite simply open it up and it starts pulling the rounds out. And as I do that, I can simply take the empty casings out like that, reload, and I'm ready to go again. Now, as we've mentioned before, the Mark VI and all the Webleys before it mostly used by officers. However, they were used by some other ranks, some other soldiers during the First World War. At the beginning of the war, the Mark Vs and Mark IVs could be issued to pipers of Scottish regiments. Later on, they were issued to machine gunners as well, machine gun crews, and then also to airmen and to tank crews as well, obviously because of the limited amount of space within those early rhomboid-shaped tanks. Now, the 4.55 Webley is reviewed in the 1920s, and they're manufactured right the way through into the early 20s, but it's reviewed in the 1920s, and they decide that this .455 man stopper round is really not required. Something this heavy isn't going to be required in warfare from this point onwards. So the Webley, in its form as you see here, is made slightly smaller and chambered in .38, which is just a slightly smaller round. However, it's not the end of the story for the Mark VI Webley, because it carries on in service with some units chambered in .455 right through until 1947.